Welcome, welcome, dear listeners. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Music and Politics. Today we discuss Napoleon and Beethoven, revolutionary heroes, authors of the unheard of act, self-made men who reshaped the civic and the symphonic and changed music and politics to our very day, crashing into each other with fateful consequences. We'll discuss Beethoven's Eroica Symphony, his dedication he retracted, and then his one and only opera, a prison rescue story, Fidelio. Thank you for joining us. It's great, of course, right? We have the new Napoleon movie, and in many ways they're kind of twins. Mozart, Beethoven is the Napoleon of music in many ways. And Mozart is kind of more of a kin of his age, right? If anyone's seen the movie Amadeus, of a kind of Enlightenment despot, right?
Was Mozart before Beethoven?
Yes, right before. They overcrossed, of course, we're talking both of them living briefly at the same time in Vienna, end of the 18th century. So this is basically right on the cusp of the French Revolution, just at a high point of Enlightenment philosophy, right? The writing of the encyclopedia in France, and Diderot, and Voltaire, Rousseau, right? All the various political philosophies that are charting a new way beyond whether it's secularism, democracy, all the basic principles here. But I just wanted to start out, let's go right back to this point of subtext versus text. How do you intervene in music, and why music and politics can go together, but what we're trying to move away from, and everything we're going to talk about all the future episodes, is music camouflaged, or where one must search, grasp at interpretations to make it politically alive. That's not what we're doing. In many ways, people can overinterpret, project onto the music, right, or try to draw out meanings that aren't really there, or at least are not there on the surface. A whole other phenomenon that we won't tackle at the moment is when music is misheard politically, or there are misinterpretations, right? Like the famous one, right, Born in the USA, for instance, Ronald Reagan appropriating that kind of Vietnam veteran anthem. And Mozart is a transitional figure. If we look at, we're just going to take one from Marriage of Figaro. This is a case where Mozart also had to submit, and his work was affected by censors, and where some of his most pointed texts were suppressed. And Marriage of Figaro is all about the droit du seigneur, the great right of the aristocrat to essentially take the women of his underlings, of his employees. Exactly. Yeah. Right? Which you can imagine, right, was one of the most flagrant injustices of the feudal system. And, there's a speech there that, from Figaro, nobility, wealth, rank, high position, such things make a man proud, but what did you ever do to earn them? Chose your parents carefully, that's all. Take that away, and what have you got? A very average man. So it's this great stirrings, right, against the feudal hierarchy. Let's go right into some music, and we'll recount here. So this is now coming from an aria, Se vuol ballare, from the Marriage of Figaro. Let's have a brief listen.
Sappilo, 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 ma piano, piano.
Right, it's a statement of perseverance, of commitment to overturn the droit du seigneur here. So it says, right, I'll teach you. He says it's the underling will become the powerful in charge. And he says, all your schemes I'll turn inside out. So it's a kind of, right, a subtle, just a few years before the revolution. And if we see it as kind of an iconic toppling toppling of the injustice of rights.
And
They're out. Yeah.
who was
What
the
do you think?
audience at this point in time for Mozart?
Right. I mean,
I am assuming it was the hoi polloi, the high class people. Is hoi polloi high class?
no, it's the opposite.
The opposite,
So,
yeah, right.
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 It's the
So the
masses.
creme de la creme of,
Yeah.
of society. I'm sure they're the ones. So he
Right.
was this popular, this message of
Right. It's
having a go at them?
It's still the
Criticizing
Austrian
them?
Empire, right?
Yeah.
At the time, remember, the Austrian emperor, who was still the Holy Roman Emperor, the last one, actually, until Napoleon overturned, his sister, remember, was the Queen of France, Marie Antoinette, so Joseph II. And Mozart was, of course, extremely well ensconced and embedded in the court and the world of the aristocracy. I think that's also why not only that the messages are somewhat subtle, right, if not buried, to say, right, I'll teach you, I'll turn it inside out, which itself went too far. I mean, we have to give that to Mozart. That even went too far. Nevertheless,
You mean there was some pushback against
yeah,
that?
absolutely. No,
Really?
this was originally, it wasn't performed in earlier versions of the opera. And I think what makes Beethoven different, and I think to have politics, to even really have politics, in a sense anyone would agree on, you need to reach a general public, right? You need a mass audience. I think Mozart probably didn't even have the concept or may not have been interested in that. And that's why we can begin rightfully with Beethoven, who for the first time is trying to reach a general audience, a mass audience. And that's a precondition, a prerequisite for politics, to make and to think through politics.
So his audience was then very different from that of Mozart. Mozart was playing for the court and for the aristocracy, but Beethoven at least aimed his music at
Right.
general, like the
Right.
first pop music.
In a
popular
way,
music.
right, because you could go to the concert hall. I mean, if you were lucky, probably very few people alive ever heard it more than once or twice in their lifetime, incredibly so. But at least you had the opportunity, whereas no one was being let into the Hofburg, let's say, into the palace. And you also have, Beethoven as an entrepreneur musically, where he's able to publish manuscripts that can then be reproduced and also made available, let's say, piano reduction and otherwise. So that's why there's always this motif of Beethoven as kind of like a Prometheus. And it's funny that, Mozart is kind of the progenitor of the anti-hero, right? If you look at the Don Juan figure, right, who is a kind of rascal, beloved rascal, and the transition from anti-hero to hero, that Beethoven is a kind of individual, self-made individual of the civic sphere. And it's interesting when analyzing his work, this is another way that it's not, let's say, a subtext or buried or muddled, is that he's referring to himself. He is the protagonist of his own music, of his own world. That's also another precondition for politics, arguably. When you refer to yourself, right, your own labor, your own context, a quote from Beethoven, his response, which probably Mozart would never have said directly to one of the princes, Austrian princes, Prince, what you are through chance and birth. What I am through my own labor. And musically, there's no greater kind of shotgun
Yeah, he
sound.
seems to be echoing what Mozart said, about the average birth, but he's saying it's stronger.
Exactly. He's bringing it right out in front, so it's unmistakable. Let's go with the shotgun blast of the new self-made man. Okay, the name itself, right? Eroica, to label it that way. The length, the size of it itself. We talked about, right, moving into big concert halls outside of the court here. And this first movement of Eroica, so this is Beethoven's Third Symphony, was longer than most of the symphonies itself that came before. The first movement was longer than entire symphonies, including of Mozart and Haydn, all the people we think of as more classical. And if you hear the dynamism of it, the fact that, it's a larger sound, There's syncopation, which is this, right, rhythm accenting the offbeat. And then there's also kind of unexpected notes that he lands on there. All reflect a kind of a struggle, a dynamism that's not there before. I mean, if we think of it politically, right, I think, there's two statements of political philosophy and politics that we can connect it to. On the one hand, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, the kind of this constitution of human equality, human rights, that transfers radically for the first time, right, sovereignty away from, right, the sovereign, right, as a person, and instead to the people. And that there are natural rights that are in humans. Humans all have these abilities and these talents, right? And these natural rights is also what empowers them to resist oppression. And in a way, in their own life, Beethoven, and let's add Napoleon, we'll come to Napoleon more in a moment, are the greatest example just through their biography. The fact these are people who don't really come from wealth or privileged. Both of them came from a kind of minor amount. Certainly Beethoven on the island. Beethoven already has a distinguished musical background, but actually came from, interestingly enough, from Holland, migrated right then to Bonn and then to Vienna. And just like, Napoleon, of course, where he was born, Corsica was Italy, and then goes to France. So that's interesting itself, that kind of migrant journey they both took. But yes, please.
So do you think that Beethoven had these kind of issues firmly in his mind of like the struggles of the more common man? I mean, I know, wasn't it true that he did actually he withdrew his name from one of his pieces of music that was originally meant to kind of celebrate Napoleon.
Yeah.
But then he grew disgusted with Napoleon.
Well, Napoleon became a conqueror, an oppressor, an occupier of his town. French troops rolled into Vienna. We're going to get to Fidelio, and affected, right, the premiere of his one opera. Beethoven only wrote one opera. And I think it's interesting, right, because it's a clash of the titans. It's these two great self-made men of the Enlightenment who end up, right, kind of at odds with each other. And you could see it, right, it's kind of Enlightenment gone awry or out of control, that, right, Napoleon, who begins as a kind of, by the way, not only was he a military general, but he had held almost every single rank in the French army. He worked his way up, right? So he was a corporal too, like Hitler, but the difference is that he then became, right, a captain, and a colonel, and then a general, and then all the way up to consul. So he had served in every possible rank, basically, proving himself. But of course, he then never stopped after general and after consul, and then ultimately, right, emperor, but self-crowned. He took the crown away from the Pope. So anyway, even that, right, on the one hand, it's kind of a tyrannical act, but on the other hand, it's also undermining the authority of the Pope, who he put under arrest. But just finishing the point, though, about getting to the politics, about the Declaration of the Rights, the document, let's say, of the French Revolution, is that it also protects and provides for communication of ideas and opinions, which of course has to be balanced with disturbances of the public order, right? Great tension in that.
It seems to be reflected in the U.S. First Amendment and the freedom of speech.
Right, this is kind of the main, right, it's the Bill of Rights, absolutely. So they're kind of related there. But I think that's why music, its politics in a way, is can you really have it even before the end of the old regime to provide for that? And the other major point, more from philosophy, is Kant's definition of what is enlightenment, which is essentially relieving humans from their self-imposed immaturity. And Kant uses, right, the Latin phrase, sapere aude, dare to know, right? That we're in charge of our own thinking. Do not outsource your thinking. Immaturity is self-imposed. Think for yourself. as the ultimate statement there, right? Well, the Third Symphony, going back to that, right, 1803, Eroica, and then Beethoven, right, he actually struggles a lot with this opera. And, of course, the political struggles are just adding to that, right? Like you said, this kind of breakup with Napoleon, where he scratches out the dedication page to him at the start of the Third Symphony. But interesting about Fidelio is that it's basically an opera. It's a revolutionary rescue opera. It's about liberation from a political imprisonment, and it has a very complex performance history as well. Because, I mean, it's based on a rescue opera genre from earlier in the 1700s, right? And it's actually, it has its origins in what some have said is a true story of an aristocratic woman who disguises herself as a man to free her husband, who was wrongfully imprisoned during the Terror, during the French of the Terror, right? And interestingly, of course, that's why do revolutions have a terror, right? That paranoia leads to purges. We see that in the Russian Revolution, also in the French Revolution.
The terror here being the uprising of the common people against the aristocracy.
Well, the terror here was after the revolution was already, right? This is after the storming of the Bastille, after the execution of the king and queen. There are uprisings in France, mostly in the south, in the west, by royalists, by conservatives, people who oppose the revolution, the Vendée, most famously. And this is, by the way, how Napoleon basically makes his mark in the revolution, is by leading the troops who are there to put down these counter-revolutionary, the anti-revolutionary uprisings, which, from depending on your point of view, might lead to big casualties, massacres. And that's another case of the revolution perhaps spiraling out. But what's fascinating as a text in Fidelio, it's not only about liberating prisoners, but it's also about a woman becoming a man, or disguising herself as a man. So kind of, you could say it's right up an early transgender, but also about the power of a woman to be able to go into a prison. And that in of itself, if we think of, right, secularism and gender equality is a big part of the Enlightenment kind of politics. So basically, the interesting thing is that the first performance of Fidelio was actually during the military occupation of Vienna. And then there's so many famous performances of it that go all the way through modern times. I mean, today you can see it as depicting Mandela on Robben Island, or depicting during a Latin American junta. Even in the Nazi period, it's performed by Jews imprisoned, also by Nazis after the invasion of Austria, the Anschluss, and after. Let's go back to some music and listen to two parts of it, right? One thing is this choir of prisoners. I mean, it's a kind of an opera all about lightness and darkness and imprisonment and freedom. Maybe most clearly brought about through this choir of prisoners. And you can hear as they're right there, they've been deprived of the light and of freedom, and how they describe finally seeing it again. Let's have a listen. Joy at the end, they repeat over and over again. Only here is life, the dungeon is a grave. Only here is life. And you can hear, right, the swelling, the dynamics, the light, right, emerging.
This is when they've been let out of their cells for the first time.
And it's interesting that they calling it a joy at the end, right, more famously is the Ode to Joy, right, Beethoven's Ninth, about fraternity, another, of course, major. But I think this more directly, because it's about political prisoners, wrongful imprisonment here, and a tyrannical prison guard who's a character in the opera. And, we want to move to the finale here, which is, right, it's the freeing of a prisoner. And, I mean, the interesting thing about Fidelio, right, and of course it has loyalty, right, Fidelio, it's a kind of comradeship, loyalty in that sense, right, almost like political prisoners or fighters might have with one another, is that Fidelio doesn't exist. Because Fidelio is actually Leonora, is actually the wife. It's her disguised name.
Yeah.
Right, it's her
He's
code
a
name.
character made of character.
Right, it's sort of
in the play.
Right, it's kind of a code name. It's funny that actually, and maybe that speaks to like the possibility of heroism and reaching that and a political struggle, that maybe it speaks to having to imagine, like recreate oneself. It's all about self-creation and having to reach what they called at the time the unheard of act. This phrase used. And that was kind of uniting Beethoven and Napoleon in a way, is that they both reached a plateau that was no one else even saw or could have imagined before. That unheard of, the unimagined, right? So let's have a listen. This is towards the end, right? The finale, where you do have the reunion of, right, the wife dressed as a man with her husband who was locked in the dungeon. So this triumph of joy and an amnesty for the prisoners, as well as an actual breaking of the chains, Leonora Fidelio actually tears the chains off, breaks them, throws them off. And some productions often actually have a toppling of an equestrian statue, which we see as kind of iconic symbol of tyranny, whether, right?
Literal overthrow.
Right. The Robert E. Lee, right? Charlottesville, we think of that as an ultimate symbol that became such a galvanizing, right?
I think of Saddam Hussein statue.
And that too, there you go, in Iraq. So that's sometimes also featured here. Great. Well, thank you for listening. And next time, we're going to move on to another great kind of duet of music and politics, moving from Mozart and Beethoven then to Wagner and Meyerbeer, right? Another generation or so later, the stakes are higher, right? Not just about revolution and aristocracy, but really about racism and nationalism. So we'll see you next time.
Cool.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. See you. Bye.
Thank you for listening, dear listeners. Please remember to rate and review and to like and subscribe to Music and Politics. Please send any questions to musicandpoliticspod@gmail.com. That's one word, musicandpoliticspod. And do seek us out on Patreon at Music and Politics Pod. Once again, one word, Music and Politics Pod, where you can find membership that opens the door to curated reading and listening lists, as well as meetings and consultations with our team. Fare thee all so well.